record. And whenever you're ready, this time look into the camera.
Okay.
And go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay. Christina Ulreich, first grade language arts, Rockwell School.
Okay, great. Okay, so now you can look at your eye line, and we'll start with the first questions. We want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. First question, how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before the lesson and what will come after it?
Okay. Throughout all of our literacy units, we've really been focusing on helping students make the reading-writing connection. And that's really important because students need to understand how to make meaning of the words that they read so that they can comprehend, but it's also important so that way they can start to notice the author's craft that are in those stories and look at them as writers. And the ultimate goal is to help them understand how the words and the pictures and the author's craft helps them as a reader, but then how they can also apply that knowledge to their writing. And if they can ultimately apply it to their writing, that's our goal. So all of our literacy units have been built in that way to use mentor texts to help students understand and comprehend, and then to then eventually analyze the craft that they see and use it in their writing. Leading up to this, we have worked on looking at the elements of fiction and nonfiction, and really in this past unit, they've been looking specifically at story elements in literature and looking at how authors develop their characters and how they use different crafts, specifically looking at the illustrations and the text to help them figure out how the characters are feeling. Because by understanding how the characters are feeling, it will help them understand the, I lost my train of thought. It will help them understand and empathize with the character so that way they can get a better idea of what the character is feeling. And then eventually we would, after this lesson, hope that they would be able to apply that craft when they're writing narratives, and so that they would be able to use that craft to show how the characters and their stories are feeling. Does that answer everything? Okay.
Okay, so I just hit record again, and then the next, let's see. Okay, so going back to this question, discuss the sequence of lessons that surround this one lesson.
Okay. So prior to this lesson, we have been looking at the overall story elements in literature, and that's a review of what they've learned in kindergarten, and we're continuing to look at that in first grade, but digging a little bit deeper. So now, instead of just looking at being able to identify the different story elements in literature, they're looking at how the authors craft specific pieces. So for example, character development. And that's really what this lesson hits on. So what we've been doing is just really identifying the different traits or feelings that the characters show in a text. But now we're really taking it a step further, and now they've been able to identify. So prior to this lesson, we read the book all the way through once, and the purpose of that was for them to get the gist of the story and to read it and comprehend it as readers, and look at how the character is angry in the story. And then the reason for reading it in that way is now that they have a general understanding, we can now look a little bit deeper into the work as writers and look more at character development and how an author really purposefully chooses words and phrases and pictures to help us understand. And it's not just by coincidence that we can figure it out, that it's all planned for. And then following this lesson, we're going to help them look at other books to see and kind of collect more evidence that we were collecting today, and to compare it with other texts so that eventually they can have a repertoire of writing strategies that they can use on their own.
Great, you're doing great.
Thanks.
Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of texts designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, please give an example of other texts that form this sequence.
Yes. This text is one of the first that I'm using in this sequence. We have read other stories that deal with different characters, but that's just been kind of in a more general way. But now this is really starting to focus in on that character development. So this is the first book in the sequence that I'm using. Following this, I am going to be using excerpts from Today I Feel Silly, which is all about different feelings. And then we're also going to look at The Way I Feel, that also explores feelings. And the purpose for these lessons is to now build on this initial understanding that they got from this first text and to make comparisons, make text-to-text connections to then build that knowledge. And and then we will continue to use those other texts in the sequence, but then to look at different types of feelings. So we focused on the feeling of anger right now because that's a common feeling that most kids can make connections to and they have felt before, so they have an experience with that. And we'll continue to use Today I Feel Silly and The Way I Feel to explore different types of feelings. There are also some other books by Dr. Seuss that talks about different My Many Colored Days, and we will use that as well to look at the different types of feelings that are portrayed in literature.
Talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of the standard?
Okay, this is what I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. Okay. All right, I wish I could. I want to make sure I'm reading it properly.
Do you need a few seconds?
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so again, talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard?
Okay. There were a few standards that were addressed in this lesson, the first of which was reading literature standard, and it's identify words and phrases that suggest feelings or appeal to the senses. And another standard is a language standard. And that one talks about being able to identify nuances in word meaning. So that's really like the shades of meaning. Those are the two major standards that we focused on. We also focused on speaking and listening because there was a lot of discussion that took place, and that specifically addresses collaborative conversations and being able to ask and answer questions. It was mostly teacher directed at this point, but then starting to gradually release the students to talk together in partnerships. And what I did to try to make connections to this lesson to make sure that they reflect the full intent of the standard is my objective was how, oh wait, hold on a second, sorry, I don't remember what my objective was. My objective was to notice the illustrations and text that Molly Bang uses in her story that lets us know that Sophie is feeling angry and how those feelings change. And by putting in the piece about how Sophie's feelings change, I feel like that addresses the language standard. So the first standard for reading literature is identifying words and phrases that appeal to the senses. So that was pretty, I think that was probably the most obvious piece of the lesson because the majority of the lesson was focused on looking at the pictures and the words and phrases in the text that let us know that Sophie was angry. And then to address the language standard that talks about nuances in meaning is we started to compare how angry Sophie was, because on the first page that we looked at, that was the first time the author really let us know that she was angry, and she used a red background, she was frowning, and those were all things that the children pointed out when we looked at the text. Then on the next page, you could tell that her anger was building, and the author showed us in her pictures and also in her words that she said that she was kicking, she was screaming, she wanted to smash the world to smithereens, and you could tell that she was stomping in the picture, her mouth was open, the word smash was in little tiny pieces to give the students a clue as to what the word smithereens meant, and that was where we really started to talk about, well, is she as angry as she was on the first page, or is that feeling changing? And they were starting to get the idea that because of the language that was used in the text and in the pictures, that she was actually more angry because of the way that the author described her.
Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies, and why?
I need to look at those again.
You're saying the information.
Okay.
Okay, so recording it now. Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies, and why?
I think the first core action that was demonstrated in this lesson was core action 1, and that is to focus the lesson on a high quality text. And the reason I think that that was exemplified in the lesson is because the majority of our time was focused on looking at the text. The text was truly at the center of the lesson. Anytime I made references to author's craft or the students did, I asked them to go back and refer to the text, and in the students' answers and in their discussions, you could see that they were definitely referring back to the text. We didn't really have anybody going off onto different tangents. It was very focused on the text. The text that I chose was very richly illustrated, and the illustrations were a major component of the craft that we were examining, and also the language that was used. The author used many different techniques such as showing, not telling, and using very specific verbs, and it was that language that helped the students to be able to figure out how the character was feeling. And that was a big reason why I chose this text. I also think that core action 2, text-dependent questions, was addressed in this lesson because all of the questions that were asked of the students were focused on that craft. We really looked at the language that the author used, the illustrations, the different craft. It was all about author's craft, and all of the questions built on that. And they started with a simple, just what do you notice in general, and then the questions were sequenced to dig a little bit deeper to help the students discover what I think is the most important part of author's craft that we don't always think about, and I think is the most important, is why the author is doing that. Because without having that discussion, noticing the different crafts is not really going to help the students to understand the story or then to later apply it in their own writing. Core action 3 was also addressed in this lesson, engaging the students in the work of the lesson, because I really dove right into the questions right from the beginning. I didn't really tell them what I noticed. I just opened it up kind of more inquiry-based of what do you notice. I gave them some guiding questions, but I really expected the students to be doing most of the work, because I do believe in teaching that the students should be doing the majority of the work, because they're the ones who are going to be expected to be able to apply these strategies later on in life. And if I don't release it over to them, then they'll have a hard time gaining independence in that way. And I really had them use sticky notes, I had them work in partnerships, and I had them really try to help each other problem solve. I noticed that a few groups were having trouble agreeing on which piece of evidence they wanted to use when it was time to share, and instead of me just telling them what to do, I asked other students to give them feedback on ways that they could solve their problem. And I think that they were able to come up with a solution based on the feedback they got from their students, and I think that that's more meaningful than it coming from me, because I think the kids really have that peer language, and coming from each other, there's just a difference in the way, however they explain it, that it really resonates more when they help each other out instead of it always coming from the teacher. In core action 4, the foundational skills that were addressed was reading fluency, because I did encourage the students to read along with me, whether it was looking at our objective and reading that aloud together, looking at the author's craft chart and reading that aloud together, and then finally and most importantly, reading the pieces from the text that I pulled out for us to analyze. We were working on that, and that was standards-based. It was aligned to the reading literature standards, the foundational standards, language standards, and speaking and listening standards for the grade. And then finally, core action 5, again, engaging the students in the work of the lesson. I tried to give them as many opportunities as they could to work out their ideas orally with each other and then sharing out to the larger group.
We're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Okay, let me just pull that up. Okay. All right. I think that this lesson really hits on shifts 2 and 3, which is your reading, writing, speaking, and listening is really grounded in evidence from the text. And the reason I'm thinking that is because I really thought about what the standards were, and then I thought very deeply about what text I wanted to use. That really gave multiple opportunities for the students to be able to speak about what they were seeing and read about, and then eventually write their evidence down. And it was all text-based. And from the student work, I look here and I see everything is text-based. Either it's something that they notice in the picture. A lot of them pulled out very specific language from the text, so that was all grounded in the text. And also using very specific vocabulary and language directly from the text was addressed in this lesson, because as students were talking, my expectation was for them to use specifically what they saw, and if they did not give me a specific answer, I probed them further to explain their thinking in a little bit more detail, to go back to the text and to use more specific language that really attends to the craft that the author used in her story.
How did you teach the content of this lesson? Prior to the CCSS, what is the same and what is different?
Okay. I think in the past I've always focused on text, but I think what especially the instructional practice guides, not just understanding the standards, but I think that practice guides have really helped me just to make very minor and easy tweaks to how I teach things. I've really made it a more concerted effort to get right into the book. I think, and again, it was well-meaning, but I think we try to build too much prior knowledge sometimes, and we never actually get into the book. And while it is important to help students access the schema that they have about certain things, I think a lot of that can be condensed, and then you can get right into the text, because I think sometimes we front load too much information. And now what I'm finding is that it's almost more, not all the time, but I almost see it as more inquiry-based learning, because I think sometimes as teachers we assume that the students might not know certain things, but I feel like it's really helped me to, especially at the beginning when looking at read-alouds, almost using that as a pre-assessment. So instead of assuming that the students don't have prior knowledge, really opening it up to them and using the questions that I ask as a way to gauge that, because a lot of the knowledge that the students need, they can get right from the text that we're using. And I think the time is better spent really looking at the text. Another adjustment that I've made is, I use a lot of picture books at this grade level, but what I've started to do is to really make the text the focus, which is core action 1, is I've been projecting my text onto the whiteboard. And the reason I'm doing that is because obviously you're holding a text up, you are letting the students see the book, but what you don't really realize is, yes, you're all together on the rug, but depending on the student's proximity to the book, they really can't always see what's on the page. They can usually see the picture, which is great, but they can't always see the text. And I've had experiences before where students will actually run up, which is great because they're so excited about it, but they'll run up to the text and they'll say, oh, see right here? So what I've done is by projecting the text, the students don't necessarily need to come running up because they really have that access to the text 24/7. And it just makes it, I think it makes the conversations more rich, and it eliminates the chance for them to really go off topic, because if you've really got that text focused on the room in the biggest space that you can find, you're always having the kids go back to it. And I think that it makes them more successful in using that when they're speaking and listening and writing.
So student...
Oh wait, I have one more. Can I add on to that?
Yeah,
There's something else.
fine.
Okay. Another thing that I've really been looking at closely is the questioning that I've been using with students. And I've always been thinking about different ways to ask questions and to make sure that they're higher level. But a big change that I've made, and it really has changed my thinking in a lot of ways, is to really think about what is the one objective that I am aiming for, and how do I make sure that all of the questions that I ask are really related to that one standard. I think, especially at this age, because we're trying to give students so many pieces of information and read aloud, especially in a rich text, there's lots of things that you can point out. And I think before, I didn't realize that by sharing everything with them, that I think it may have not been as targeted as it should have been. And now I'm realizing that it's more important to really keep that focus for that lesson, and understanding that when we come back to the text and revisiting the text is the time to maybe address those other objectives or types of questions that I want to ask. And I think it's really made me think differently about how I ask questions, and especially how I sequence them. Because I know that's one of the core actions, one of the indicators in core action 2. And that's not, I think I've thought about it before, but really being very conscious of where I'm starting with my questioning, knowing what my end goal is, and how I'm going to sequence those questions in a very deliberate way. Also anticipating where kids might get confused so I can eventually bring them back, I think has helped me to not only really focus my lessons, but to really think about the questions and be more responsive than I ever have been before. That's the other thing I'm going to say.
Student engagement is crucial to the work of the CCSS. We want to understand how you ensured that all students had the opportunity to productively engage in the work of the lesson. How did you support all students in working with grade level text? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read grade level text?
One way that I tried to level the playing field for all students was to read and then reread the text that was on the page for students who might not be able to access it yet. We do a lot of shared reading, and that's what this lesson was really all about, is hearing my modeled reading and then having them read along with me to help them practice and be able to access it. And there's one student in particular that I know is receiving tier 3 interventions. He's, well below grade level. And by allowing him that oral practice, hearing it from me, then hearing it from in a choral situation, and then hearing it from his peers, when it was time for him to share the text evidence, he was able to do that orally. One way that I also scaffolded is by allowing students the choice to use a sticky note to record their thinking for those students who were able to write down what they were thinking, but then allowing the option for students who might not have those abilities to just engage in oral discourse. Another way that I planned for allowing all students access was in the way that I paired them up. I really thought about different, not only reading abilities, but personalities, and especially when it comes to talking, you want to make sure that you don't put necessarily two really quiet kids who aren't sure together. So I tried to pair up stronger students who are very verbal with those students who might not have those skills, so that way they can benefit from hearing that peer language. And then those students also know that it's their responsibility to try to engage their peer in that conversation, so that way it's not just that one-sided back and forth.
How did you provide opportunities for students who are advanced to engage more deeply in the grade level text?
Okay, for those students, I picked on certain students when I asked certain questions that I knew would be able to answer them. Does that make sense? So I knew those students, I posed more challenging questions to them, and I also paired them up with other students because I do think that pairing a student up with another student who might not have that ability requires that student to really have a deeper understanding so they can explain it to their peer, because deep understanding is really shown when you can explain it to another person. So that was part of my thinking with that.
How do you know that the students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision? Did the students acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson?
In their oral responses on the rug, if students did not give me a specific answer, I would probe them further, and I was expecting them to use either details that they saw in the picture, using specific language, and also any details that they could access from the text. And from the student responses, eventually they were all able to do that. And then when I look here at their student work, I've kind of categorize the different things that I've seen, and their task was really to figure out what text features, what craft Molly Bang, the author, was using to show that Sophie was angry on that particular page. And I see a lot of students noticed that she had a big red shadow behind her, and on the page before we had talked about how red typically is an angry color. Another thing that I noticed is a lot of students pulled out that word smash, which was right from the text. It was in the actual blurb at the top, and then it was illustrated in a very bold way with lots of little tiny pieces. And they noticed that. I see students wrote, "I know she is really angry because she said that she wanted to smash the world." I see someone else wrote, "The word is smashed in little pieces." Someone made a comparison that she was like a giant smashing the whole world. And she wanted to break it into smithereens. So the words smash, smithereens, angry, those were all those were precise words that were taken directly from the text. So the evidence that I see here in the students' writing is letting me know that they do understand the different crafts, and I think that they are ready to move on to continuing to look more deeply and now comparing it to other authors to see now that they've seen it in one text, can they now apply it in a new situation?
Which behaviors from Core Action 3 does students best exemplify in this lesson? What actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen?
Okay, let me just pull that one up quickly. Okay. We've really, I think a great strength of the Common Core is the focus on the speaking and listening standards. And while we've always focused on speaking and listening, especially at the primary, K2 level, I think with all the demands that are asked of us, we sometimes in the past did not always give that time for student discussion. And that's a really important skill no matter what grade level you're at. Especially when getting ready for writing, I feel like speaking and listening is a really important piece. I find that if students can't speak it first, then it's nearly impossible for them to write it. And I think that's a step that's been missing in the past. So in all of our units, we really make sure that there's a focus on speaking and listening skills. And it's, really that foundational of how do I turn and talk with a partner? That's what we've been working on this year. What does it mean to actively listen? And it's not just listening, it's being an active listener. So some things we have done, for example, is we'll ask students a question and we'll pair them up. And instead of in the past, we would have said, okay, well, what did you say? What we've done now is ask them to actually share what their partner said. And that lets them understand that it's not just about you. The point of really to be an active listener is to be able to share out what you heard the other person say, and that the other person can do that for you as well. We've also taught them how to ask questions of each other, either when they don't understand something or when they want more information. Looking for more information has been a big focus of ours because we really want to encourage the students to be able to elaborate on their thinking eventually without being prompted. And I think in the lesson, there were a few times when students, they didn't wait for me to say, well, why do you think that? A lot of them did elaborate because we want that to become a habit, that I don't always need to ask them why, that they can really elaborate, not just to me, but with each other without any of that prompting. And that gradual release to eventually let them work on their own is something that they're still working on. It's probably the management of breaking out into those smaller groups is probably the hardest thing to manage, especially when some groups might go longer than others, and the students are really still working on those skills. But I think you could tell just even proximity-wise, making eye contact, those behaviors were evident in the student discussions.
Great instructors are continuously learning. We want to understand what you celebrated in this lesson and what you would improve upon. Reflecting on the lesson, what worked particularly well, and what might you do differently?
As I mentioned before, I think having the text at the center really sets you up for success. When I look at the student work, everything is related to the text. I do not see one piece of student writing that's not related to something that was directly in the text. I think it kept them engaged. I think that they had something to talk about. What I would probably change next time is just the management of the groups. I did notice some student behaviors that were not optimal for learning and discussing with each other. So I think maybe switching up some of the pairings for next time. I might also, even though the text was projected, the next time I might actually have the students bring a copy of that picture so that it's really right next to them. I think they definitely had access to it, but I think maybe providing them with a colored copy of it would help them to really focus their learning. And I know I reviewed the directions for sharing first and then writing, but I do think that maybe we need to practice that a little bit more because while I did see the students did do it eventually, I felt like I did have to stop a few times and check in with a few groups. And also I probably would have talked a little bit more about how to make a decision, especially when you don't agree on something. Like at the end when I was asking them to pick their best piece of evidence, I did decide to then put it out to the group to have the students ask each other how they could solve their problem, to put it more on them instead of just coming from me. And I do think that was somewhat successful, but I would definitely want to look more at that going forward.
Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
I did have one student who was definitely very movement oriented. So I think that was something that looking back, I think I should have anticipated a little bit more because from my experiences, I do know that he tends to be very all over the place. So I think for him, what I might do differently, and also for a few students that I notice, is maybe instead of, I just really kind of, like I said, is kind of almost like a pre-assessment because this is really the first time we've done this with them actually writing their evidence down, that maybe I should have taken a small group of students, him included, so that way I could really keep the focus in on that group and to hopefully avoid some of those behaviors that I noticed. I did allow him to stand, but then I don't know if that was really the best choice because he was standing but also kind of flailing around. So, just maybe trying to find more ways, maybe giving him a more specific task would have been helpful, or to encourage movement in a more productive way. That might have been something that I would have done differently, and that I will do differently the next time I work with him.
You're done.
Yay.
Thank you.
Oh, no